Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our annual George and Helen Kohut Symposium. Before we get started with talks, I'd like to just talk a little bit about George and Helen and why this is named in their honor. So they were long-term benefactor supporters of the Boyce Thompson Institute and also had a long-term devotion to education of high school students in particular. So Helen and George Kohut devoted their professional lives to educating and working and improving the lives of young people. Helen was a psychological counselor for children in the Montgomery, Maryland public schools, where she helped found the first Head Start program in the nation. She loved nature and was an expert in identifying birds, flowers, and trees throughout the Northeast. George taught history, social studies, and physical education, and coached golf and football for 34 years in the Montgomery County school system. After retiring, George spent his summers coaching young men and women in the game of golf and various golf camps. He refurbished golf clubs and gave them to young people interested in learning the game. Their connection to the Institute comes through their nephew, Dr. Robert Kohut, who conducted field research at the Boyce Thompson Institute from 1980 to 2004. He is now a member of the Institute Emeritus faculty, and George and Helen supported his research throughout through financial contributions to the Institute. And tragically, in 2003, Helen and George both died in an automobile accident, and the Boyce Thompson Institute was named as a beneficiary of their family trust. So in recognition of Helen and George Kohut's long-term interest in the education and well-being of young people, the Institute named the seminar that concludes the summer research program for high school and college students in their honor. So thank you, and we enjoy their benefits for several years now and hopefully continue to do so in the future. Before we launch into the student talks, I'd like to talk about my own first high school internship, how I got into research. This, I'm going to start a little bit earlier here, actually. This is grade school, actually. So I was doing research with honeybees, marking honeybees here on this feeder, and then observing them in a glass-sided beehive, which was in a bedroom, which you see back there. I had fairly tolerant parents who let me drill a hole through my windowsill so the bees could come in inside it out. And so this is my start for research in grade school. My first paid internship actually also involved bees. And specifically, I was working with Sydney Cameron, who recently retired as a professor from the Department of Entomology in Illinois. At the time when I was in high school, she was a PhD student in entomology studying bumblebees at the University of Kansas. And she claimed she had an allergy to bumblebee stings. I think she really didn't like to get stung. And so I was basically hired to do the dirty work where there are risks of getting bee stings. So if you look at what a bumblebee nest looks like when you open it up, it looks sort of like this. You have, lots of bumblebees. Here's a queen bumblebee. You have individual cells that either have pollen or nectar, honey in them, or a larvae, and then once the larvae are pupating, that get covered up like this. So this is what it looks like if you open up a bumblebee nest. They sort of buzz around a bit, but what does a bumblebee nest look like for bumblebees? Looks a lot like this. It's pretty dark. So they're usually, bumblebee nests are usually underground or in a hole or somewhere, so they don't really see each other in the bumblebee nest. So how are the bees communicating inside the bumblebee nest? What? Any suggestions? What? Back there?
Signals.
Chemical signals, of course, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Noise.
Buzz, yeah, they buzz. If you knock on a bumblebee nest, you hear them. Anything else? Direct contact, they're, they're all sort of mingled together, they're bumping into each other. But probably chemical signals are the most important. And bumblebees, like many bees, are just sort of a fountain of chemical signals. There's various glands all around the bumblebee that provide chemical signals. And for the purpose of the research that I was doing as a high school student, this mandibular gland here was the most important. And in particular, the mandibular gland produces a pheromone called queen mandibular pheromone. What that means is that you have, one queen here in the bumblebee nest. So she's the only one who's capable of laying eggs. And she also sort of maintains order in the bumblebee nest by bossing around the other bees. You see there, nudging, pushing the other bees, but also maintains order with a chemical signal with this queen mandibular pheromone. So this queen mandibular pheromone lets all the other bees, several hundred here in the nest, know there's a queen present and keeps them sort of suppressed and not laying eggs. And this gets more complicated then if you, as a researcher, remove the queen, or the queen dies for some reason. And then you have an interesting phenomenon. So normally the queen only has the only bee that has functional ovaries. A normal worker that has non-functional ovaries. But if you remove the queen, you get egg-laying workers with functional ovaries. So these ovaries here are functional. However, unlike the queen, these workers are not fertilized by a drone. And so they only lay haploid eggs, which are, again, male bees. Male bees are haploid, female bees are diploid. But sort of as a last gasp of the colony, if the queen dies, a certain number of workers develops into queen-like behavior and that they're able to lay eggs. But not all workers develop queen-like behavior, only some of them. And so Sydney's project was really to try to figure out, what's going on here. And specifically what we were doing is we took a bumblebee nest, we removed the queen, and then we observed the worker bees to see which ones were dominant. So which of these worker bees were bossing around the other bees and were starting to lay eggs. And then, deciding, this bee here might be the dominant one. And then we wanted to measure the pheromones of those bees. So then you have another problem. See, if you look at these bees, they all look the same. So if you're a high school student trying to study these bees, how do you determine which bee is the dominant one and remember which one is which? Well, the obvious solution is you number them. And so you stick a tag on each of these bees. And so you can imagine that if you have a colony of 100 bumblebees and they're pulling them out one by one, there's a certain amount of risk involved. And so I probably got several dozen bumblebee stings in the course of the summer, but it was all for the name of research. And so, once we figured out which ones bees were dominant, we then again went back to these pheromones, and I would catch what we thought was the dominant bee, let it bite into some filter paper, and then send that off for mass spectrometry. And then we determined that these dominant bees not only were physically dominant, but also had developed queen mandibular pheromone. So they were chemically suppressing their other co-worker bees from laying eggs, so that only the dominant worker bees were able to then lay drone eggs in this colony. So that was my high school internship project, my sort of introduction to research, and the start of a many years of career in research, currently mostly with plants and insects. Any questions before we continue to talks here? Anything you'd like to know about bumblebees? Nope. Yep.
Was that part of your research question to figure out, what was it about those bees that they were able to do that and produce those pheromones? Or is it kind of random? Is there a pattern about something special about those bees that they were able to do that?
I don't know specific about bumblebees. With honeybees, it's a similar sort of phenomenon, and it's again just related to the physical dominance, that the bees that are stronger are physically dominating the other bees, and then over time also develop a pheromone, which helps them then to maintain their dominance and suppresses egg laying from the other bees. So it's a combination of probably one bee is just tougher than the other bee, but then also developing a chemical suppression of egg laying for their sisters effectively.